June 18, 1864, Robert E. Lee stares at the trenches surrounding Petersburg and realizes the truth: he's trapped. The Confederacy's greatest army, the legendary Army of Northern Virginia, is pinned down. But here's what most people don't know: this wasn't the end. In fact, the South was about to launch 3 massive offensives that would threaten Washington, D.C., invade Missouri, and nearly capture Nashville. These desperate gambles would determine whether the Confederacy lived or died, and every single one of them was doomed from the start. Petersburg was supposed to fall in hours. On June 9th, Grant ordered the Army of the James to assault the city's defenses. P.G.T. Beauregard had built impressive fortifications, but he barely had enough men to hold them. One determined push would have ended it. But the Union officers hesitated. They attacked on June 15th, breached the walls, then inexplicably withdrew. By the time Grant sent in the Army of the Potomac, Lee had arrived with reinforcements. 4 days of brutal assaults achieved nothing. On June 18th, Grant accepted the inevitable: siege warfare. For Lee, this was a death sentence. The Army of Northern Virginia thrived on movement and audacious attacks. Sitting in trenches destroyed morale. Worse, Lee knew he couldn't win a battle of attrition. His army was slowly starving because the Shenandoah Valley, Virginia's breadbasket, was under attack by Union General David Hunter. Lee had no choice. He sent 8,000 men under Jubal Early to stop Hunter and save the valley. But Lee also saw an opportunity. If Early could threaten Washington, maybe Grant would have to leave Petersburg to defend the capital. It was a long shot, but what happened next shocked everyone. Early defeated Hunter easily. But instead of retreating, Hunter made a catastrophic mistake. He marched into West Virginia, leaving the road to Washington wide open. Lee immediately ordered Early invade Maryland. By July 5th, 16,000 Confederate soldiers were marching north, and panic spread through the Union capital. Only one man stood in Early's way: Lew Wallace, who would later write Ben-Hur. Wallace commanded just 2,500 troops in Baltimore, but he understood strategy. Early had to cross the Monocacy River to reach Washington or Baltimore. Wallace positioned his men at the bridges and sent an urgent message to Grant. Early is coming? Grant dispatched reinforcements, but they wouldn't arrive in time. On July 9th, Early attacked. Wallace's tiny force, reinforced by 1 veteran division, fought desperately. They were crushed. But Wallace had bought Grant exactly what he needed: 24 hours. When Early reached Washington on July 11th, Union troops were already manning the defenses. And then something extraordinary happened. President Abraham Lincoln himself climbed onto the ramparts of Fort Stevens to watch the battle. Confederate sharpshooters opened fire. A surgeon standing near Lincoln was wounded. An officer, possibly future, Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, shouted at the president, "Get down, you fool!" Lincoln became the only sitting U.S. president ever to come under enemy fire. Early probed the defenses, but it was hopeless. He retreated the next day. He'd achieved Lee's goal, forcing Grant to weaken Petersburg, but the strategic situation hadn't changed. Early escaped back to the Shenandoah Valley and even burned Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. That was his fatal mistake. Grant had had enough. He gave Philip Sheridan command of the Army of Shenandoah with brutal orders: destroy Early and burn the valley to the ground. Sheridan marched south with 40,000 veterans in August, torching everything in his path. The Confederates expected Early to replicate Stonewall Jackson's brilliant 1862 Valley Campaign, but this wasn't 1862. Sheridan's soldiers didn't panic. Every time Early attacked, Sheridan counterattacked harder. On October 19th, Early launched one final surprise assault at Cedar Creek. His pre-dawn attack shattered the Union lines. Victory seemed certain, but Early's starving soldiers stopped to plunder captured supplies instead of pursuing. This gave Sheridan time to rally his men. At 4 p.m., he launched a devastating counterattack that annihilated Early's army. The Shenandoah Valley was finished as a Confederate food source. Early's army disintegrated through desertion. By March 1865, he commanded just 1,500 men. George Custer wiped them out at Waynesboro. The Army of Northern Virginia would never again threaten the North. While Early was failing in Virginia, an even more desperate gamble was unfolding in Missouri. Sterling Price commanded Confederate forces in Arkansas. He'd been claiming for years that Missouri was ready to rise up and rejoin the Confederacy. His superior, Edmund Kirby Smith, knew Price was delusional. But Smith saw an opportunity. If Price invaded Missouri and failed, which he definitely would, it would finally prove that Missouri was lost and shut up the government in exile demanding action. Smith approved a raid with one condition: disrupt the November elections and prevent Missouri from voting for Lincoln. Price took 12,000 raiders north in September. But instead of moving quickly toward St. Louis, Price wasted days besieging Fort Davidson at Pilot Knob. His men were slaughtered trying to cross the moat. The garrison escaped in the night. By the time Price reached Jefferson City in early October, it was heavily fortified and impossible to take. He began wandering westward, looting everything in sight. Meanwhile, Union forces were closing in from two directions. William Rosecrans was chasing from the east, and Samuel Curtis was marching from Kansas to block Price's escape. On October 23rd, they caught him at Westport, near modern-day Kansas City. Price was surrounded on three sides. Curtis personally led a flanking attack through a dry creek bed. Pleasanton's cavalry smashed through Price's rear guard. Price's raiders collapsed. To escape, Price literally set the prairie on fire to prevent pursuit. Price limped back to Arkansas in December with fewer than 6,000 men and less supplies than he'd started with. The Missouri bushwhacker companies that had terrorized the state for 3 years fell apart. Missouri voted overwhelmingly for Lincoln. The Trans-Mississippi Theater was finished, but the most catastrophic Confederate offensive was happening in Tennessee. John Bell Hood commanded the Army of Tennessee. Jefferson Davis had ordered him to invade Tennessee and Kentucky, then somehow march to Petersburg and break the siege. It was insane. Sherman had just captured Atlanta. The logical move was to pursue Sherman. Instead, Hood followed Davis's delusional orders. He crossed the Tennessee River in mid-November with 40,000 men. George Thomas and James Schofield were waiting with orders to destroy him if he was stupid enough to invade. He was. On November 29th, Hood caught Schofield's army at Spring Hill, Tennessee. Hood's forces were positioned to cut off Schofield's retreat. Victory seemed certain, but confusion paralyzed the Confederate command. Officers weren't communicating. Hood issued contradictory orders. Through the night, Schofield's entire army marched right through Hood's lines. When Hood woke up and discovered what happened, he exploded with rage and blamed everyone but himself. Hood pursued Schofield to Franklin. His generals begged him not to attack. The Union position was heavily fortified with overwhelming artillery support. Hood didn't care. At 4 p.m. on November 30th, he ordered 20,000 men to assault 27,000 entrenched Federals, supported by massed artillery. It was suicide. The Confederates briefly pierced the Union center in vicious hand-to-hand combat, but were thrown back. By nightfall, 6 Confederate generals were dead, including Patrick Cleburne, Hood's best division commander. 8 more generals were wounded. 55 regimental commanders were casualties. Hood lost at least 4,500 men. The Army of Tennessee was shattered, but Hood refused to retreat. He marched to Nashville and dug trenches outside the city. Thomas had 55,000 men inside Nashville's fortifications. Hood had 25,000 demoralized, starving soldiers. Grant ordered Thomas to attack and finish Hood off. Thomas waited. He wanted his cavalry retrained and wanted winter weather to weaken the Confederates further. On December 15th, Thomas was ready. He launched a massive assault that crushed Hood's left flank. The next day, he repeated the attack. The Army of Tennessee disintegrated. Hood retreated to Alabama with fewer than 15,000 men. The Confederacy's second-largest army had been destroyed. By the end of 1864, the Confederacy had gambled everything on 3 offensives. Early had threatened Washington, but lost the Shenandoah Valley. Price had invaded Missouri but destroyed the bushwhacker movement. Hood had marched to Tennessee and annihilated the Army of Tennessee. All 3 offensives failed catastrophically. Lincoln won re-election. There would be no negotiated peace. Lee remained trapped at Petersburg with no relief coming. The South had exhausted its last reserves of men and supplies. The only question left was when, not if, Grant would break through and end the war. The Confederacy's final gamble had failed. The endgame had begun. Want to know how it all ends? We're covering Grant's final assault on Petersburg and Lee's surrender at Appomattox in the next video. Hit subscribe and the notification bell so you don't miss it. And if you enjoyed this video, leave a like. It really helps us bring you more Civil War content. Thanks for watching.